Welcome. I'm really delighted to formally introduce Ravi Iyer, who many of you know already. Ravi is a social psychologist who's used his doctoral degree to make a positive impact in the world, like the best of scholars. And among highlights from what Ravi's accomplished, he was the executive director of civil politics, translating research around political division to support groups that foster social cohesion. Um, we believe Ravi was doing similar work on the inside at Meta, where he was a research and product manager for 4 years. And now Ravi's managing director at USC's Neely Center, similarly bringing science and evidence to bear in the effort to make the internet serve society. And more broadly, from my vantage, I see Ravi's just a great force in the responsible tech community, seeking out and creating opportunities for collective action. So welcome, Ravi.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
And so you all know we're here to, one of those endeavors to bring the field together. We're going to be talking about later is the code. But first, I wanted to ask you, Ravi, this is a question that I've been asking a lot of people over the past year. What does pro-social design mean to you? And then if you could also tell us a little bit more about the work that you've done related to pro-social design.
Yeah, happy to expand on it. I was really excited for the existence of the Pro-Social Design Network because it dovetails really well with my experience at Meta. I joined to fight polarization, to work on things like hate speech, misinformation. I quickly realized that, trying to enforce upon policies against misinformation and hate, while a lot of good work is done in those realms, there's definitely a ceiling as far as what you can achieve. There's always going to be disagreement about what is misinformation, about what is hate. Hate often depends on context. There's a lot of work by, I forget the exact group, Dangerous Speech Project that talks a lot about how context really matters. So I started working more on the core design of our algorithm side. So not how do I remove the stuff that is appearing in people's feeds that is misinformation or hate, but how do I create a system that doesn't incentivize misinformation and hate in the first place? Because, I think if people were just saying some of the things that they say because they really believe them, that'd be one thing. But a lot of people were saying, I'm saying things I'm not proud of because they do well in your algorithm. I don't actually believe some of these things, or actually, it's not exactly how I phrase it, but if I phrase it in a more inflammatory way, it does better. So I think we really have to work upstream, not just work on how do I remove the bad stuff, but how do I encourage the good stuff? And I think that's what pro-social design is. A lot of people have used the term safety by design. I think I've actually been thinking and I've actually used that phrase myself to describe some of this work, but I actually think pro-social design is a better phrase because sometimes safety by design can often mean okay, there's misinformation on the page. Should I put a little stamp on it to say that many people disagree with this, or do I put a community note on it? And I think, that is important to do. And I think that's good work. But I think it's also even more important to think about why did that misinformation get created in the first place? What is it that we're doing about the way we create our systems that incentivizes people to say, crazy things just to sell t-shirts? And how do we create a world where the actual economic incentive is not to say crazy things, to say truthful things? Like in the real world, I have an incentive to say truthful things. Can I create the same incentives online? So that to me is what pro-social design is. It's tackling things more upstream, not thinking about, what is the bad thing that I want to remove, but thinking about how do I create a playing field that encourages good things. And once you do that, then hopefully there are less bad things to worry about on the back end.
I love it. I'm so glad we just recorded that. So fantastic. Everyone knows a little bit about, has the link to the Neely code. I think a lot of people have reviewed it before. Ravi, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the code? And I think primarily I'm interested in what impact do you hope it will have?
Well, we just released the code, so it's kind of hard to know exactly what impact it will have. But the code's actually based on a lot of things that have been publicly shared about what Meta has done. I used to work with Frances Haugen. Some number of the things that she leaked were things that my team had written or I'd written. In those documents are many experiments that the platform had run to, for example, remove the incentive to reshare and comment and anger react on, especially for political content, and showing that that leads to, better outcomes for misinformation, for reports of bullying, for consumption of hate speech. So it's the code is already the code's really more embodiment of best practices that have already had an impact. They are things that platforms have done, break the glass measures that people will often do in terms of elections, in terms of places where there's more risk of violence, and in some cases have launched in a steady state. And when you do enough things in response to violence or crises, you start to wonder, like, I'm doing this thing over and over again. Maybe I should just always do it, right? Like you heard people say that after Facebook, said they turned on certain things after in advance of an election, and then people were like, "Well, that kind of was a better experience for us. Why don't you just leave those things on?" So we're trying to just illuminate, and all of this information are things that are public to some degree, maybe not highlighted as well as they could, and we're just trying to like illuminate the things that are already being done. Facebook's not the only platform. Other platforms do things like this as well. They're just, the information is sort of scattered in various silos. So hopefully by taking this information, trying to aggregate it into a set of more concrete principles, a lot of people would love to lean into design more. There's many people who work on the moderation world, and they kind of dread the nonstop effort of continually cleaning up the ecosystem, and they want another tool in their toolbox. We're hopeful that this gives people another tool in their toolbox. It is not, everyone who signed it is someone who had other things they think should also be done, but it is a start. It is a set of things that I think a large group of people, not everyone, but a large group of people can agree upon, that we can start a conversation about concretely what can we do to design these systems better. And so I'm hopeful that we only just started talking about it publicly. I'm hopeful that as we build more consensus, we can start to meaningfully have a conversation with platforms where it's not just, you should get rid of all the hate speech, but here's like some more specific steps that you can take that that we can verify. Like, it's not in their power to get rid of all the hate speech in the world, nor would we want them to try to get rid of anything that anyone would consider hate, which would include things like, people complaining that men are trash, or that, people, just being spicy, right? Like, we don't want to do that. What we want is for people to have an incentive to say more authentic and trustworthy things like they do in the real world. And then if they are going to say something that's a little spicier, they really mean it. They're not just doing it to get clicks.
I love it. Let's keep the spice. And also interested in what you said about somewhat what we're doing is just kind of presenting what's known as best practices, and we have time to circle back to that. But before I open the floor, I really wanted to ask you about code number 2, which I personally find the most interesting. So this is the code that is about optimizing, not for kind of what people indicate by their behavior they want, but optimizing for user perceived quality. And so I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that. And first, why you think it's really important, and then also if you can talk a little bit about how you would do that. You mentioned that you can measure user perceived quality in a number of ways. Tell us a little bit how you would put that in practice.
So I think the uncontroversial thing that people can sort of look inside themselves and intuitively understand is that there are things that we engage with that we don't necessarily think are good for us or high quality. So I will pay attention to a fight video or something disgusting, or something sexually suggestive, but I don't want more of that in my feed. I know that stuff is kind of like a cheap way to get my attention, and I would prefer to consume something that's more, informative, or something that actually helps me, that's more useful. In some domains, this is not a big deal. If entertainment content can be somewhat sensational, and maybe it's just kind of distasteful, but it's not. But I think for certain kinds of content, it actually can be harmful. So incentivizing political content based on like what gets more comments back and forth incentivizes people to post things like, can you believe this thing that this person said, right? And then people just go back and forth. Yeah, that person's terrible. Yeah, I agree. And it's not necessarily, it crowds out higher quality information. It sets the wrong incentives for the kind of discourse that we want our political leaders to lead to drive. And so I think it's fairly and there's evidence both internally at Facebook. There was a recent study by Smith and Milley that compared Twitter's algorithmic feed to its non-algorithmic feed and showed similar results, that basically for political content or various other kinds of sensitive conversation, because political is kind of a hard thing to define, but for things that are important, we don't want them to be things that are optimized for engagement. We want them to be things that are optimized for quality. And the second part of your question was like, how do you do that? And that's an unsolved problem. But it's not like we have no efforts in that direction. So platforms have often done surveys. Do you perceive this? So one thing I worked on was comment ranking. Do you perceive this comment to be high or low quality? Users will engage with comments that have profanity. They tend to think that on average, they are lower quality, right? So, and so that's where engagement signals and quality signals will differ. And so that's true for many ways that people ask about quality. You can ask about posts, you can ask about your session, you can ask about your experience in general. And many platforms, not just Facebook, have done, quality surveys, and it's public because people can see these surveys being run on the platforms if you've taken them. And so it's to be determined. And that's one thing about the codes, is like, we're not saying we know exactly how to do it. How you do it on some platforms probably differs from how you do it on other platforms. But just the aspiration to try to optimize for quality, some perception of user perceived quality, as opposed to what people engage with, will, in every case that I've seen it, will at least put you on a path towards better outcomes. And then you can iterate from there. So yeah, we don't have like a complete, we can talk about things that people have done, and we can sort of dissect the pros and cons of various approaches. Sometimes people use quality, in general. Sometimes people use, where do diverse groups of people agree on quality measures, right? That's kind of like the community notes algorithm. So there are various ways to do it, but I think just capturing that you should try to do this as opposed to what you're doing with engagement is the important thing.
That's great. I want to open up the floor in a couple, one last question from me, and then folks, if you have questions, you can start popping them in the chat or raise your hands. But so to that point about it's these codes aren't going to be implemented the same across the board. I think I'm not a technologist, but I'm kind of imagining what conversation I've heard for folks with smaller companies, so not the Facebooks, that it's just don't often have the capacity to to do everything we wish we could. So, there's any thoughts about how like prioritize parts of these codes, or what would you say to like a smaller, medium-sized platform?
Yeah, I mean, first I'd say, I've had conversations with some of these smaller platforms too. And, oftentimes the problems that exist are more pronounced on bigger platforms, and they do have more resources. So we acknowledge that explicitly in the code, and we're not saying that every platform that's just starting should start with all of these things at once. But the other thing I'll say is that some of these codes are actually easier than the content moderation approach. It is hard to build up a reporting system, to build up, hate speech detection, to build up all the things that like people want to do to be a responsible actor in the space. It's harder to do that than to add something like an I don't like this button and integrate that into your algorithm, because you don't necessarily need people to review the I don't like this. You could just sort of say that like, well, I don't want to show people things that they don't like, that people are saying they don't like. So you can do a lot by changing your user interface set. So one way to do optimize for quality would be to do surveys, and maybe that's hard. Another way to optimize for quality would be to create user interface elements that are more indicative of quality. So if I have a like, that might be indicative of quality. It could also be indicative of like just social support for some position. If you had an informative button, it's probably a little bit closer to people's perceptions of what is quality than not. And just by changing a like to an informative button, it's an easy thing that smaller platforms can do to start to optimize for quality. So I'm not saying that all platforms should do this. And again, the codes are very explicitly written to be like, these are things we think are good ideas. How people implement them, whether through policy, whether through voluntary means, it's up to them. But we just want to give people ideas for how to avoid the traps of, that have plagued many of the larger players. And here are things that we can learn from to maybe take better steps from the inception.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to open up the floor. Before I do that, I'm going to stop recording and we'll go to Q&A.
I have a question.